Titanic. Few events in the 20th century can conjure up the mystique, intrigue, and emotion that encompasses the memory of this once mighty ocean liner. The Titanic was not just a ship. She was a symbol, a technological masterpiece that showcased man's latest engineering marvel, whose spectacular interiors and lavish amenities played host to the world's most rich and famous. To immigrants, the Titanic represented new hope, a way to escape the social and economic hardships of their homelands and start fresh in the new world. To the world, she was invincible. Invincible until she met her destiny in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. From her ambitious beginnings, through the last hours of her fateful voyage, until her rediscovery 75 years after she slipped from the ocean's surface, we will separate myth from reality and expose the unanswered questions to provide the clearest picture yet of what happened on the night of April 14th, 1912. Join us as we take the 2.5-mile journey below the ocean's surface and rediscover the Titanic. In the 85 years since the Titanic's tragic demise, the world's fascination with the events surrounding her maiden voyage have never waned. What has made this tragedy so unique that it captivates generation after generation? Well, perhaps it's the period in which the Titanic first came to life.
Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, the people of Europe were gradually developing a sense of security about the world in which they lived. There were no great wars to speak of, and the steady expansion of industrial progress provided an abundance of jobs for the workforce. The shipping trade and shipbuilding had been a major source of income for the residents of England and Northern Ireland. The story of the Titanic began in 1867, when 31-year-old Thomas Henry Ismay purchased the bankrupt White Star Line that was founded in 1850, and whose sailing fleet had been in the Australian trade. His dream was to enter the highly competitive North Atlantic passenger business, going head-to-head with the dominant Cunard ship lines.
I think at that time, White Star and Cunard were still pretty much rivals, because before Cunard came out with the Lusitania and Mauretania, White Star had the biggest and best ships.
The battle for dominance of the Atlantic passenger trade continued between the Cunard and the White Star Line. First one, then the other would gain the lead by introducing the latest technological advances. Soon luxury and size became more important than speed alone. With the growing industry of commercial travel and the increased numbers of immigrants coming to North America, financier J.P. Morgan, then a railroad magnate, had become interested in expanding his horizons and entered the transatlantic passenger trade. He began buying up shipping companies to create a consortium large enough to crush the Cunard and German lines. In 1902, White Star became the newest member of his shipping trust, the International Mercantile Marine. Although 3 of White Star's partners retired, Bruce Ismay was asked to stay on and ultimately took control of the new conglomerate.
And as time went by, more and more people were immigrating. You had this huge amount of immigration, and there was a need for bigger and bigger ships. And you had, in America, I think more and more people becoming the moneyed class who could then travel, return to Europe, and would do so if they could do so comfortably.
The time had come for a new Olympic class of liner to be born. On a warm summer evening in 1907, Bruce Ismay and his wife were having dinner at the home of Lord James Peary, a partner in the Harland and Wolff shipyard who built all of White Star Line's fleet. Before the evening was over, Ismay and Peary had hatched a plan for the construction of 3 world-class liners that were 50% larger than anything the world had ever known. The ships would be called the Olympic, the Titanic, and finally, the Britannic. The men moved immediately to bring their dream to reality, with Lord Peary's staff drawing up the practical designs, while Bruce Ismay secured the financial blessing of White Star's owner, J.P. Morgan. In order to accommodate the construction of the first two massive Leviathans, 3 berths in Harland and Wolff shipyard had to be converted into 2. A 220-foot-high gantry was constructed over the 2 new slipways that became objects of wonder to those along the banks of the River Lagan. On December 16, 1908, more than a year after Bruce Ismay and Lord Peary launched their ambitious plan, the first keel plate was laid down for the new breed of superliner, the Olympic. 3 months later, on March 31, 1909, the Titanic's keel plate was laid, and the beginning of a legend was born. In the early 1900s, the Industrial Revolution was taking shape in many forms across the globe. The United States was expanding at a rapid pace with money, business, and immigrants pouring in to take advantage of the great promise the New World offered. With the announcement of the Olympic and Titanic, the White Star Line effectively raised the bar on transatlantic travel. On the morning of June 1, 1911, the monumental task of fitting out the Titanic's empty hull had begun. For the next 10 months, Harland and Wolff's 14,000 skilled craftsmen went to work, shaping and honing the superliner's cavernous interiors. The attention to detail lavished upon her came from a 300-page builder's handbook that contained specific instructions regarding the installation and adjustment of the thousands of items and systems that would be used on board. The enormity of her design is what set the Titanic apart from any ship of her day. Engineers equipped her with both turbine and reciprocating engines that allowed for better speed and efficiency. She carried 29 boilers. The largest of her 3 anchors weighed 15.5 tons, requiring a team of 20 horses to transport it.
It took several million man-hours to outfit and refine the Titanic into the most magnificent vessel of her time. In February, the Titanic was towed to Belfast Harbor's new graving dock, where she was fitted with propellers and given a final coat of paint. By March, time was running out for the builders. On April 2nd, the Titanic and her owners were preparing for sea trials, which would test her nautical systems and equipment for speed, precision, and maneuverability. As 4 tugboats guided the great lady through the River Lagan and down Victoria Channel, hundreds of spectators crowded the banks as the ship set out to open sea for the first time. At 8 p.m., she returned to her berth, where Representative Carruthers signed the Board of Trade certificate stating that the Titanic was, quote, good for 1 year from today. Later that evening, the ship's anchors were raised as she departed Belfast, passing into the Irish Sea on her way to Southampton.
The sun rose over Southampton's harbor at 5:18 a.m. on April 12, 1912. Her crew began converging on the docks at the break of dawn. Captain E.J. Smith, who was previously the captain of the sister ship, Olympic, arrived just after 7:30 a.m., where he went directly to work preparing the ship for her maiden voyage. One problem that had plagued the ship was a coal fire that had burned out of control in boiler room number 6. It was believed to have begun in Belfast when the pirated coal was being loaded into the ship without being properly wetted down. Smoldering ever since, the fire burned as stokers worked to get it under control. Up on deck, the passengers were beginning to board in large numbers.
When we got to Southampton, for some reason or other, my mother wanted to or had to see the purser before we went to our cabin. So we went and visited the purser, and during the conversation between the two, the mother said to the purser, I am not one bit happy about going on the Titanic to New York City. And the purser said, why? She said, because the Titanic is new, it's never crossed an ocean, and she said, I'm afraid something might happen. And he said, Madam, nothing was going to happen, but if it does, he said, the Titanic has watertight compartments that'll keep it up until help comes.
The fanfare and excitement surrounding the Titanic's maiden voyage had become an even bigger media event because of the many celebrities of high society who were scheduled to make the trip. Finally, it was time. The last passengers aboard, the Titanic was ready to begin her maiden voyage. On the bridge, Captain Smith welcomed Bruce Ismay, director of White Star Lines, and Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, as he gave the order to depart. The steam whistles blew, signaling the tugs to take her out. It was the moment all had been waiting for, as the passengers on board and the crowds below erupted with joy as the great liner got underway. The tugs proceeded to tow the Titanic very slowly in order to maneuver the ship through the channel maze that leads to the open sea. Low tide had just begun, and the ship had to be handled with extreme caution. The Titanic was again being guided through the channel to sea. As she reached the open waters, the tows let go their ropes, and the great liner began the next leg of her journey to pick up more passengers in Cherbourg, France, 77 miles away.
She was a glorious sight against the purple skies of sunset as the two tenders came to greet her. Within 90 minutes, 22 passengers whose final destination was Cherbourg had disembarked and another 274 taken aboard. Among the socially prominent coming on were millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim, American illustrator Samuel Ward Stanton, Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon, a well-known fashion designer of the day, and Mrs. Margaret Brown, who after the tragedy would be remembered as the unsinkable Molly Brown.
As the tenders returned home, the clanking sound of the Titanic's anchors being raised are heard from a distance. By 8:10 p.m., the great lady of the sea is heading out into the night for one more step before her fateful trip across the Atlantic. The Titanic's first night in full service passed uneventfully. By morning, the crew had assembled for emergency drills. Assistant electrician George Irvine described the events on board in a letter to his mother. Quote, "The alarm bells rang for 10 seconds. Then about 50 doors, all steel, gradually slid down into their places so that water could not escape any one section into the next. So you see, it would be impossible for the ship to be sunk in a collision." End quote. A sentiment that was surely shared by all of those on board.
The word unsinkable wasn't really pushed by the White Star Line. I know of only one brochure ever that referred to the construction of the new ships and called them practically unsinkable, or they had features that would make them practically unsinkable. And the word unsinkable wasn't really used by the White Star Line, wasn't promoted, but the design was there. The design was in the ship to make it practically unsinkable. That they had watertight bulkheads that went across the ship so that if anything struck it from the side or head on, it had these compartments that would be then watertight when these doors would close. And so you couldn't, if you hit it from the side and punctured 2 compartments, if you hit it right at the wall separating them, it could float. If it hit something head on, if you punctured 3 of the first 5 compartments or even all 4 of the first 4, the ship would continue to float. And so theoretically it was unsinkable because it couldn't imagine something that would do greater damage than that, other than maybe several ships hitting it at once or something. And so in the minds of the builders it was practically unsinkable. It wasn't advertised to the public, but word got out. And so employees of the White Star Line and travel agents, everyone would say, well, these ships are unsinkable.
The trip to Cherbourg, France took only a few hours, enough time for the passengers on board to have a meal and explore the great wonders the Titanic offered. Francis Brown, a 32-year-old candidate for the priesthood, took the opportunity to photograph some of the splendid sights found on board. During his stroll, he found second-class passengers mingling in the crisp sea air, with a view of the Palm Court entrance below. On the first-class promenade, he discovered a young boy spinning a top as his father looked on. These candid shots are a living reminder of life on board the great liner. Meals were being served in the dining saloons. The White Star Orchestra could be heard playing The Tales of Hoffmann and Cavalleria Rusticana in the first-class lounge. For those inside enjoying a glass of port or an after-dinner cigar, it was hard to imagine the gale-force winds blowing on the top decks. The ship had a wonderful steadiness on the open sea. As the evening wore on, passengers would find their way back to their staterooms and berths to be lulled to sleep by the churning hum of the ship's engines.
By 11:30 a.m., the anchors were dropped again as the Titanic sat 2 miles off the coast of Queenstown, Ireland. She was met by the tenders America and Ireland, who ferried the last passengers to join her transatlantic voyage. 113 third-class passengers and 7 from second class came aboard, with a total of 1,385 sacks of mail destined for the United States. The transfer was less chaotic than had been at Southampton and Cherbourg, as the stewards in attendance had systems in place to handle the large crowds. Francis Brown was one of the few passengers disembarking at Queenstown. With his photographic plates in hand, he boarded the tender, bidding a fond adieu to the ship and her passengers. Unbeknownst to all on board, a 24-year-old stoker named John Coffey had stowed away under some returning mail bags. With his address listed as 12 Sherborne Terrace in Queenstown, it is assumed that he signed on to the Titanic's crew in order to obtain a free passage home, an exit that surely saved his life. As the tenders departed, the Titanic's whistle sounded 3 mournful blasts, indicating its imminent departure. The starboard anchor was raised, and the mighty engines began turning the propeller shaft. The Titanic was again on her way, this time sailing to New York. As she proudly slipped past the green hills of Ireland's coast and into the setting sun, no one knew that time was running out for this great lady. Her destiny lay ahead in the North Atlantic in the shape of an iceberg that was to meet her hull in just 2.5 days.
Life on board the Titanic was a glorious experience for more than 2,300 passengers who sailed on her maiden voyage. In every class, the days were spent enjoying leisure activities like reading, writing, listening to the orchestra concerts, or playing cards in the many rooms and lounges on board. There were no formal organized dances or parties scheduled, just relaxation and the pursuit of individual interests. For first class, this meant scheduling time on the squash courts, going for a Turkish bath, or taking a swim in the adjacent pool. Second-class passengers took advantage of the well-stocked library and comfortable smoking lounge that was connected to an enclosed promenade. Third-class passengers could be found strolling on one of 2 open decks toward the bow and the stern of the ship. Below deck, many gathered around the piano in the general room, singing favorite songs and creating a festive atmosphere for those who played table games. The only scheduled ritual observed by passengers was mealtime. Every morning, noon, and night, ship's bugler P.W. Fletcher alerted passengers to gather in the dining saloons. The galleys aboard the Titanic were busy round the clock, preparing and serving 6,000 meals a day.
The Titanic was running in perfect order. The passengers were at ease on the greatest ship ever to sail the earth. The fire in boiler room number 6 had finally been extinguished after burning continuously for the better part of 2 weeks. Messages of good luck and congratulations were streaming into the Titanic's wireless room from other ships in the Atlantic. The Empress of Britain, heading to Liverpool, sent her regards on Friday, as did the French vessel La Touraine. Included in each of these greetings were warnings of ice. It was not uncommon for there to be ice warnings in April in the North Atlantic. Senior Marconi operator Jack Phillips and his assistant Harold Bride worked tirelessly, passing on the friendly greetings to the bridge while handling the mounting requests of the passengers. At about 11 p.m. that night, the wireless apparatus ceased to function. It took most of the night to repair, leaving the operators both exhausted and well behind in their duties. By midday Saturday, reports of field ice, bergs, and growlers continued to come in from ships like the California, the Colby, and the Minnesota. The location was near the parallel, directly in the path of the Titanic. As evening set in, the ship and her passengers were to enjoy their last peaceful night at sea.
In the early morning hours of April 14th, the sun rose out from the ocean, creating a spectacular prism of light and color in the North Atlantic sky. As the staff and crew made the routine shift changes, the passengers emerged from their quarters rested and prepared for breakfast and Sunday worship.
The temperature, even at noon, still carried quite a chill. Many third-class passengers stayed indoors after lunch and started an informal dance in the general room. This was the time when many conversations and card games took shape in the smoking lounges and public rooms all over the ship. At 1:42 p.m., iceberg warning received via the Baltic, stating large quantities of field ice in latitude 4151 north, longitude 4952 west, about 250 miles ahead of the Titanic. This message, too, was given immediately to Captain Smith, who carried it with him to the promenade deck, where he passed it along to White Star's Bruce Ismay. Ismay glanced at the note and placed it in his pocket. The first of many fatal mistakes that was to occur that day. Later on, Ismay produced the message during a conversation with first-class passengers, stating cavalierly that the Titanic was amongst icebergs. It wasn't until 7:15 that evening that Captain Smith would ask for the note back to put it up in the chart room. As many of the passengers left the decks for the warmth and comfort of the ship's interiors, the captain delayed the ship's scheduled turn at South 62 West to South 65 West for half an hour as a precautionary move to avoid the ice fields. When the captain did make the turn, it was calculated that the ship was now 16 miles further south than their original course. As fate would have it, the captain didn't go far enough.
By 7:15 p.m., the Titanic was approaching the first ice field. The night was just beginning for the ship and her passengers. In the wireless room, junior operator Harold Bride was busy writing up the day's accounts when he received a message from the California to the Antillean, describing 3 large icebergs, 50 miles dead ahead. He immediately brought the message to the bridge, although later he could not remember which officer received it.
Captain Smith, in the meantime, was enjoying the company of George and Eleanor Widener's dinner party in the Ritz restaurant with several of the ship's more prominent passengers. Shortly before 9 p.m., the captain excused himself and went to the bridge, where he found Second Officer Lightoller on duty. They discussed the weather conditions, in particular how the moonless sky and flat, calm waters could cause problems in identifying icebergs from a distance. The two agreed that there would still be a certain amount of light reflected from the ice, and that even with the blue side of a berg pointed towards them, an outline of white could still be seen.
At 9:20 p.m., Captain Smith retired for the evening, his final orders being, "If it becomes at all doubtful, let me know at once. I shall be just inside." With that in mind, Lightoller sent a message to the crow's nest to keep a sharp lookout for ice, particularly small ice and growlers, until daylight.
9:40 p.m. Heavy ice pack and iceberg warning received from the Masiba. Message overlooked. The wireless operators too busy with passenger traffic. As the ship continued to cut a path through the icy waters of the North Atlantic, the crew and passengers of the Titanic had no way of knowing the fate that awaited them. Out in the distance, an iceberg lay waiting as the great lady sailed on, ready to meet her destiny. At the same time, the lookouts in the crow's nest noticed a slight haze directly in front of the Titanic. 10 minutes later, they see an iceberg dead ahead, towering 55 to 60 feet above the water. The ship is now traveling at 20 1/2 knots. The lookouts, Fleet and Lee, immediately sound the warning bell and call down to the bridge, "Iceberg right ahead!" The time between the lookout's warnings and the collision with the iceberg was less than a minute. First Officer Murdoch, the officer of the watch on the bridge, had instinctively called, "Hard a starboard," had the engines stopped, and then reversed the engines, which actually steered the ship into the iceberg. Now it was too late. Officer Murdoch threw the switch that closed the watertight doors. The collision had occurred at 11:40. The iceberg sent pieces of ice into the upper decks through the portholes. Henry Sleeper Harper of the American publishing family awoke and saw the iceberg quickly passing his window. Other passengers couldn't understand what was going by. In the first-class smoking room, everyone stood as the jarring motion shook the room. Some went to the promenade deck to see what had happened.
All four of us were in bed asleep until near midnight, and my mother was awakened by dead silence. She realized that the boat had stopped, the engines had stopped, and so the boat had stopped, and she wondered why the boat had stopped on its way on the Atlantic Ocean on its way to New York City. So she got rather concerned, and she went out in the hall, or opened the door, and out she saw a cabin steward, and she asked him, and he said, "Oh, there's nothing much the matter. They're fixing it now, and they will have it fixed in a little bit, and you go back to bed and forget about it."
Meanwhile, a worried Captain Smith, now on the bridge, sent out Officer Boxall to assess the damage. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, was awakened by the scraping noise. When told by Captain Smith they had struck the ice and the Titanic was seriously damaged, he was surely shaken. His unsinkable world record-setting ship and his dream had turned into a nightmare. During the first 10 minutes after the impact, the first 5 compartments began to take on water, and boiler room number 6 was flooded with 8 feet of water.
The damage to the Titanic done by the iceberg was maybe a little over 200 feet long. If you were to measure it from the very tip of the bow, because we don't know how close to the very bow it ruptured, it did rupture the very forwardmost compartment, and all the way back to the point in the second boiler room aft where the firemen said there was just a short distance of damage, that water looked like it was maybe a fire hose pouring into the room. And you don't have a 300-foot gash, it's only about 200 feet. And so it wasn't really a big tearing, it wasn't a huge thing, but this gash, as we've always described it, was probably a shearing of rivets and buckling of plates and separating them, perhaps, causing them to part, so that water did pour in. I mean, people inside the ship said it was like the whole wall of the ship gave away, but they still had time to get out of the boiler room they were in, so it couldn't have been, a complete collapse of the wall, or it would have just instantly flooded.
The mailroom, 24 feet above the keel, begins taking enough water to float mail bags. Following the reports to Captain Smith of water pouring into number 1, 2, and 3 holds, he sends Thomas Andrews out to do his assessment of the damage. Andrews calculates the ship can stay afloat from 1 to 1.5 hours only. This is based on the mathematical certainty that if more than 4 holds are flooded, once a compartment fills with water, the water will spill into the next compartment, and so on. The Titanic's bow begins to sink. The ship is doomed. Captain Smith orders CQD distress call for assistance sent out over the ship's wireless. The boilers are shut down, and relief pipes against funnels blow off huge, noisy clouds of steam. At 12:05 a.m. on April 15th, the order was given to uncover the lifeboats and muster the passengers and the crew on the boat deck. It took passengers a while to realize that the ship was indeed sinking. As the first and second class passengers headed toward the lifeboats, the third class passengers were faced with blocked stairways and corridors.
The elevator was not working that night, so we had to climb 4 or 5 flights of stairs.
Whether intentional or not, the first and second class passengers had the best opportunity to leave the ship.
They're going to launch the lifeboats. He said, now don't let it worry you, it's just a precaution. And he said, you might even be back again before breakfast, but they're going to launch the lifeboats, so come along, I'm going to help. And he immediately started to help, and with absolutely no trouble at all, because we were there. And that's the most emphatic point, because we were there.
However, even with this opportunity, the lack of lifeboats sealed the fate of half the passengers. The ship carried lifeboats with a capacity for only 1,178 people, slightly over half of the more than 2,200 people on board. The irony was that the Titanic had been fitted with state-of-the-art davits designed to hold 64 lifeboats instead of the 16 that she carried. Amid the panic and confusion, the lifeboats began to be loaded. Women and children first.
And the officers put my little brother and sister in the lifeboat, but they would not let my mother get in. And she just screamed at them, and she says, "Please let me in. Those are my little children." So they did let her in, but they would not let me in. So when Mother got into the lifeboat, why, she yelled up at me, and she says, "Ruth, go on down the boat, down the deck, and ask the officer if you can get in that boat." And I said, "All right." So I went down, and I saw the officer putting people in the lifeboat. And I went up to him and asked him if I could get in. He says, "Why, sure." And he picked me up and dumped me in.
The first boatload was number 5, and it was lowered with only 28 aboard. Anna Warren of Portland looked back at the ship and saw through the portholes that the stateroom she and her husband had stayed in on D-deck was now at water level instead of way above.
And so this boat was lowered away with me beginning to scream because I realized my father was not with me. And it seemed a terribly long way down from when we were put in it until we were on the water, and very jerky, I seem to remember.
It was because on the Titanic, which was new, the paint wasn't dry in some places, and the paint was not dry in the pulleys, and the rope stuck to the pulleys, and that's what made the boat go down unevenly.
As the lifeboats were being filled and lowered, Jack Phillips in the radio room was sending distress signals. The Californian, which was about 20 miles away and had been rudely cut off earlier in the evening, had shut down its wireless for the night. The Cunard liner Carpathia received the distress call from the Titanic at 12:25 a.m. and changed course to come to her aid from 58 miles away. It was a full hour after the collision that Captain Smith ordered the distress rockets to be launched. The lookout on the Californian saw these, but by this time, the Titanic was so low in the water that he didn't think much of it, since there was no distress call relayed to him. The women and children with a crew member to command the boat continued to load. Numerous ships hear the Titanic's distress signal, including her sister ship, the Olympic, some 500 miles away. Virginian 170 and Carpathia 58 miles prepare at various times to come to assist. 12:15 a.m., the band begins to play lively ragtime tunes in the first-class lounge on A-deck. 12:20 a.m., water floods Seamen's quarters 48 feet above the keel on E-deck. 12:55 a.m., first portside boat number 6 lowered with only 28 on board, including Molly Brown. Starboard number 5 is lowered. Bruce Ismay is chastised by First Officer Lowe for interfering with his command. Only 41 aboard. Room for another 24. 1 a.m., starboard boat number 3 is lowered, with only 32 aboard, including 11 crew. 1:10 a.m., starboard number 1 is lowered, capacity 40, with only 12 aboard, including Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon, and 7 crew. Portside number 8 loaded and lowered, carrying only 39 people. It is steered in the water by the Countess of Roth. 1:15 a.m., water reaches the Titanic's name on the bow, and she now lists to the port. Tilt of the deck grows steeper. Boats now begin to be more fully loaded. 1:20 a.m., starboard number 9 leaves with some 56 people aboard. The Titanic has now developed a noticeable list to starboard. 1:25 a.m., portside boat number 12 is lowered with 40 women and children on board. 2 seamen are put in charge of the boat. Signs of panic begin to appear among some of the passengers. A portside boat, 14, is lowered with 60 people, including 5th Officer Lowe. A group of passengers appears ready to jump in the already full boat, and Lowe fires shots into the air to warn them away. The Titanic's distress calls now near desperation. We are sinking fast, and women and children in boats cannot last much longer. 1:35 a.m., portside boat 16 is lowered with over 50 people. Starboard boat number 13 leaves with 64 people, mostly second and third class women and children. Starboard boat number 15 is lowered 30 seconds later with 70 people aboard and barely avoids collision with boat number 13 as it's lowered on top. 1:40 a.m., most of the forward boats are now away, and passengers begin to move to the stern area. Bruce Ismay leaves on collapsible C, 39 on board. The last starboard side boat launched. The forward well deck is awash. 1:45 a.m. The words heard from the Titanic by the Carpathia on her way to the rescue. Engine room full up to boilers. Port side boat number 2 is lowered and leaves with only 25 people. She can carry 40. 2 a.m. Water now only 10 feet below promenade deck. 2:05 a.m. There are now still over 1,500 people left on the sinking ship. The final lifeboats left full to capacity. One even with 70 people aboard. Many of the passengers and crew members jump overboard. The ship's lights blink once and then go out.
I saw the horror and heard the horror of that ship, and I maintained from that night until this day that that ship broke in half as it sank. I am convinced of it. I know it's true. And certainly the forward part went down nose first, and the other part stayed up in the air for what seemed to me to be a very long time.
2:20. The Titanic's broken off stern section settles back into the water, righting itself for a few moments. Slowly, it fills with water and again tilts its stern high into the air before slowly sinking into the sea.
And the horror of people drowning is something that no one could possibly tell you.
While the stern fell more or less straight down like a lead weight, possibly rotating slowly as it fell, the bow probably planed gently away at a slight downward angle while accelerating at a much faster rate toward the bottom. 3:30 a.m. The Carpathia's rocket sighted by lifeboats. Her normal speed is 14.5 knots, but she has raced to the rescue at a shuddering 17.5 knots. 4:10 a.m. First boat, number 2, is picked up by the Carpathia. Ice floats all about the disaster area amid debris from the Titanic.
And then, of course, the dawn came up and we saw these icebergs all around us. And we saw what, to me, looked such a tiny little ship coming toward us, threading its way through the icebergs.
5:30 to 6:30 a.m., collapsible A survivors rescued by boat number 14 and collapsible B by boats 4 and 12. 8:30 a.m., last boat, number 12, picked up by the Carpathia. Lightoller is the last survivor to come on board. The Californian arrives at the site of the Carpathia and then streams through disaster area to undertake final checks for survivors. 8:50 a.m., the Carpathia leaves area bound for New York. She carries 705 survivors. An estimated 1,522 souls have been lost. Bruce Ismay wires White Star New York offices. Deeply regret, advise you Titanic sank this morning after collision with iceberg, resulting in serious loss of life. Full particulars later. The loss of the unsinkable Titanic was a tragedy for all involved, especially the third-class passengers who were not wealthy and were headed to the United States to begin a better life. Of those, only 69 men and 105 women were saved. 1,417 men and 119 women died. Of the second-class passengers, 104 women and 15 men were saved, while 142 men and 24 women and children were lost. The first-class figures show that 54 men and 145 women and children were saved. 119 men and 11 women and children died. Of course, the most devastating figures are those of the crew members, including Captain Smith, who went down with the other 685 men and women in his crew. 214 crew members were saved. Part of the lure and the mystery of the Titanic will always be its unanswered questions. Would a different captain have avoided the iceberg? Could the ship have been prevented from sinking? What kind of gash did the iceberg cause in the hull? When the wreck was discovered in 1985, some of these questions were answered, but more were posed. The discovery proved that the Titanic has become an object of fascination for millions. Even now in 1997, the fascination continues. Movies and a Broadway show are living reminders that the mystery is still uppermost in our minds. In 1912, the technology did not exist to find or photograph the sunken Titanic. However, by 1980, things had changed. In July of that year, U.S. entrepreneur and explorer Jack Grimm funded a scientific expedition to find the Titanic. Bad weather and equipment malfunction caused the expedition to fail. Jack Grimm funded 2 more expeditions in 1981 and in 1983. They also failed in their search. Success in finding and photographing the Titanic was finally achieved in 1985, when Dr. Robert Ballard finally discovered the Titanic at a depth of 12,460 feet. This was just the beginning. On July 14, 1986, a tiny submarine holding 3 men finally came to rest on what was once the wooden deck just forward of the mast from which lookout Frederick Fleet had spotted the collision-causing iceberg in 1912. Nearly 75 years later, Martin Bowen, Ralph Hallis, and Dr. Robert Ballard were first to board the Titanic since her maiden voyage. Ballard and his team continued exploring in the Alvin with camera Jason Jr., taking video footage of the wreck. The story of what happened to the Titanic after she fell under the surface began to unfold. The Titanic's stern section sustained massive damage. It appears that the decks collapsed, one on top of the other, upon impact with the bottom, causing the hull to literally blow apart. The Ballard team photographed hundreds of objects from the ship lying near the stern, including a bronze deck bench frame and a rust-draped bathtub. They also saw a battered soup tureen, a copper saucepan, a statuette from the first-class fireplace, and a footboard from a first-class stateroom. These were just some of the thousands of objects that fell out of the ship as it sank. Contrary to many expectations, the deep ocean did not preserve the Titanic from decay. Softer materials such as cloth, paper, and most woods were eaten away by deep-sea organisms. The wood decking and furniture were nearly all gone. Only a few pairs of shoes indicated where bodies had once rested. Huge fingers of rust extended from exposed metal almost covering the hull. Even so, the wreck remained in a remarkable state of preservation, an underwater museum. Of course, this became a problem. Although the U.S. Congress tried to prevent the Titanic from being looted, in 1987, thousands of White Star artifacts such as fine china and silverware were raised by a group of American and French investors in a submersible nautical. The U.S. Senate responded by passing a bill which forbade the sale or display for profit of any Titanic salvage in the United States. So, why did the Titanic sink? Did finding her answer this question? In one way, yes, and in others, no. All of the testimony at the inquiry in 1914 seemed to exonerate Captain Smith, who, although could have made other choices, did not do anything so wrong as to cause the tragedy. If Captain Smith was not to blame, can the builders be at fault? Well, she'd been designed with the latest safety features, the best fire detection apparatus, watertight doors, and bulkhead divisions. What the discovery in 1985 did was tell us that the ship broke in two as she was sinking, possibly because the locking of the watertight doors in only 6 sections may have caused the bow to become too heavy with water and slip quickly into the sea. It is certain that other expeditions will travel to the Titanic. We are all fascinated by the story of the largest and most luxurious ocean liner in the world that set out on her maiden voyage with the wealthy and most socially prominent of 2 continents, hits an iceberg, and sinks in 2.5 hours as an excruciating human drama takes place.